Good evening. Thank you all for attending this. This is actually a story that took place 80 years ago, a prisoner of war escape story from Singapore. As you all will probably remember, in February 42, Singapore fell, not unexpectedly, but fell disastrously. The last time that a British force had surrendered, a British-led force had surrendered anywhere, had been in Kutalamara when Townsend surrendered 30,000 British and Indian troops to the Turks. This time in Singapore, 135,000 British, Australian and Indian troops surrendered to the Japanese. My father, Markandan Pillai, MMP for short, was one of those 135,000. This is a picture of him as a captain with the ribbon of the military cross, which is depicted below. He was an engineer who joined the army in 1940. In March 41, he joined the Bombay Sappers. In March 41, along with the company that he was then posted to, 45 Army Troops Company, 45 ATC for short, when I refer to it. They were embarked on the troopship Devonshire, heading towards Egypt. When they reached Suez, they were turned around. They'd been equipped and trained to fight in the North African deserts, but they ended up fighting in the jungles of Malaya. When they reached Malaya, they were first stationed at Kuala Lumpur and thereafter at Kelantan province in the northeast, where they built defenses and demolition work, preparing for the invasion that they knew would happen. And then finally, in December, if you all recall, on the 7th of December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the most famous attack that you hear about. But on the same day, it was the 8th of December here in Asia, actually the attack on Kota Bharu that you see here took place 2 hours before the Pearl Harbor attack. But the Japanese came from Indochina. Yamashita's 25th Army came down from Indochina and through Siam at Singora and Patani and Kota Bharu. Both these landings were unopposed. Kota Bharu, there was an Indian brigade of the 9th Division which provided defense for that area, and they put up quite a fight, but they were overwhelmed quite soon. 45 ATC, my father's company, which consisted of 8 officers. My father was the only Indian officer at that time, and 240 Sikhs and Maratha sapper Jawans. They were moved post-haste from Kuala Lumpur, from their camp in Mantin, to a place called Crow, where they joined an ad hoc brigade group called Crow Col, short for Column from Crow. That column was sent up to meet the Patani group at a place called the Ledge, which is just a hilly area. At the Ledge, the Japanese were already in occupation of the high ground, and Crow Col was roundly defeated between the 10th and the 12th of December and sent reeling back. The blue lines indicate the passage of 45 Army Troops Company. The red lines indicate the manner in which the Japanese came down. The Japanese managed to outflank and outmaneuver the Allies in all battles. 45 ATC took part in battles at Ipoh, Kampar, and on the Slim River here. The Slim River was the largest battle, but all were round defeats. Eventually, they were then pushed off to the Pahang River to build an alternate ferry for the Kuantan Brigade, which was retreating after the Japanese had reached there. As I've just recounted to you, the Japanese totally outflanked the Allies with the use of amphibious troops. Their tanks rammed through the Malayan jungle. The British had no tanks except these small brain carriers. The Japanese aircraft, the Mitsubishi aircraft, were way superior and far outnumbered the British Buffalo Brewsters, old American aircraft that they had. And the Japanese used cycles all over, while the Allies were restricted to road and rail transport. Then we came to the southern battles. In the southern battles, they came back from the Pahang River. I'm talking only of 45 ATC now. And they took part in the Battle of Moar River here. From the Moar River battle, again they were pushed back, and the bridge at Paritsalong was another battle. The battles in blue are the battles in which 45 Army Troops Company did not participate. The battles in red are the ones in which they did participate. Finally, in between these two battles, between the battle in Moar River and the battle at Paritsalong, my MMP and about 7 of his soldiers were left behind to carry out demolitions on some culverts. As a result, they got stuck behind Japanese lines for 4 days, and they had a very difficult time getting back through the jungle and managing to get back to their lines. Luckily for them, they did. But eventually, on the 31st of January, 45 ATC retreated across the Johor Causeway into Malaya, into Singapore, among the last troops to reach Singapore. In Singapore, 45 ATC again set up demolition and defense works all over Singapore, but they ended up fighting as infantry in hand-to-hand combat on defending Bukit Timah Hill in the center of Singapore. 45 ATC suffered very heavy casualties. Out of the 8 officers, 4 died, and out of the 240 Jawans, 97 died before they surrendered. These are a few photographs of Yamashita striding into Singapore, General Percival being escorted to the surrender meeting, the surrender by Allied officers and other troops, and the Japanese victory parade, and what came in the newspapers the next day. The Japanese, the surrender took place on the 15th of December, 42. On the 15th of December itself, the Japanese insisted that all troops would be segregated, Australian, British, and Indian. Accordingly, Major Ronald Dinwoodie, my father's commanding officer, ordered him as the only Indian officer to take the 134 odd troops left behind to report to the Japanese. They were ordered to assemble, all Indians assembled at a place called Farrer Park, which still exists in Singapore today if you visit Singapore. In those days, it was a pretty large park, and 67,000 men assembled in Farrer Park. They were harangued by the Japanese Kempeitai, the intelligence branch of the Japanese army, and by some INA officers. My father never was able to identify them actually. On the 16th, that same day, because Japanese security was fairly lax, he made his first escape attempt. He slipped down from Farrer Park at night, reached the coast here, which is just about a mile and a half or 2 away, and attempted a swim to Sumatra. There are lots of islands on the way to Sumatra, so he thought he'd make it being a good swimmer. But on the way, he saw some sharks. He got scared, turned back, and slipped back into Farrer Park the same night. On the 19th of February, they were allotted various camps. MMP was first allotted Bidadari camp. Subsequently, all sapper officers and men were shifted to Tayasol camp. But that was a couple of weeks later. The 67,340 Indians were all allocated Bidadari, Tayasol, Bulla, Pasir Panjang, Kranji, Tenga, and Bukit Panjang, also called Nison, when the INA made it their initial headquarters. The Australians were in Sembawang and Selatar. There were about 19,800 Australians, and there were 38,000 odd British soldiers who were in Selarang and Changi. the Japanese did not have sufficient troops to provide guards for all these prison camps. So they used Formosan troops, conscripts actually, a few Kempeitai or intelligence officials, and eventually later INA soldiers as guards for all these camps. The Japanese system of governing the camps was fairly brutal. They did not follow the Hague or Geneva Conventions. Executions and beheadings were very common in the initial few days. In fact, this was the period in February, March, when the infamous Sukching massacres occurred. You might have heard of these, when 50,000 Chinese were rounded up from all over Singapore and lined up along the coastline and shot one by one. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, is one of the lucky youths who just managed to escape because of some papers that were missing or something like that. Food was always scarce, and life generally was pretty rough in these camps. At the same time, it was very slack security. What the Japanese did was essentially use all these troops for labor. In the mornings, officers would be ordered to move the troops out to do some work, some defense work somewhere or the other. In fact, they carried it to the extreme. They moved them thereafter to Siam, including a lot of Indians who worked on the infamous Death Railway. You might remember the Bridge over the River Kwai, the movie that was made some years ago. They were also sent to Borneo, Rabaul in New Guinea, to Manchuria, and to the Andaman Islands to work as labor. In fact, MMP's commanding officer, Ronald Dinwoodie, his story is quite strange. He, at some stage or the other, he was moved from Changi to Borneo, where he worked for a few months as slave labor, then shifted to Rabaul in New Guinea, and then eventually he was shifted to Manchuria. The Red Cross found him in November 1945 in Mukden, now the city of Shenyang in China. Things being quite bad, my father MMP had definitely decided that he was going to escape. A lot of people tried to dissuade him from it. In fact, Ronald Dinwoodie himself had told him before they actually got separated, that Kirky was a very long way to go back to the depot. But knowing that he was very keen on escaping, he even handed him his last bits of money, the 30 Straits dollars that he had. He gave MMP that money. As soon as MMP settled down in Tyersall, he started practicing walking barefoot to harden the soles of his feet, to the extent that all his colleagues around thought he'd gone a little mad. He also quietly looked around for colleagues, compatriots to accompany him. He didn't want to do the journey alone. He found a doctor, a Captain Natarajan, who was about 8 or 10 years older than he was. And he had met a person called Mr. Radhakrishnan, who was a lecturer in the Singapore Trade School before the hot war had started. Now Radhakrishnan and he got in touch again, and Radhakrishnan was very keen to move back to India, so he joined the group too. So the three of them planned, and they would occasionally get Radhakrishnan into the camp to plan the escape. The entire planning, they also collected a whole lot of anti-malarial tablets since they had a doctor with them, and they planned the entire escape on an atlas that my father had by luck found just before he entered the prisoner of war camp. The choice of routes, they initially planned to reach Chungking, because this route apparently had no mountains and no great rivers except the Mekong River. They could go through Indochina or through Siam or right through Burma and finally into China. They also looked at, but weren't very enthusiastic about a route through Burma to reach the hills near Tamu. There's the Tamu-Moreh border. Even today, Moreh exists at our border post. And they also thought of reaching Akyab, which, as far as MMP knew, was still in British hands. They decided to leave on the 6th of May, and on the 7th of May, just before that, they were told that on the 7th of May, Mohan Singh, who had become the general of the Indian National Army, was coming to give them a lecture. But that didn't deter them. They decided to go nevertheless. But they were worried, and as you can see later, they left their Bidadari camp on the 6th of May, but they holed up for 2 nights in Radhakrishnan's house in Singapore. I think they did this mainly because they were scared that they might have been found out. I'm not quite sure why they did this. After holding up for 2 nights, they went to the station and with great trepidation bought 3 tickets on a goods train to Penang. The train journey was quite uneventful. There were lots of Indians on the train. They tried to be as unobtrusive as possible, and they reached Penang with no problem whatsoever. But once they reached Perai station, they had to cross to the island of Penang on a ferry boat. And there were a lot of Japanese guards, which my father described it in his book, they were quite apprehensive about it. Nevertheless, they managed to get through. And in Penang, they learned that they had to get visas or passes or passports or something of that kind to enter Siam. Accordingly, they went to a Chinese photographer who assured them that the photographs that he gave them would fade within 30 days, and then actually approached the Japanese local station commander, who was a very junior officer. They pleaded with him, explained that they were onion and potato traders, and Radhakrishnan had the brilliant idea of suggesting that he wanted to supply the Japanese actually. So, having accepted that, they were actually issued these 3 passes. Feeling very secure, they then left Penang back to the railway line, and they reached the Padang Besar frontier station. At Padang Besar, the railway line stopped and the Siamese railway started. Here they found that they were not being allowed on the trains at all by local Japanese troops. The Japanese troops had kept shooing them off the whole afternoon. They spent an afternoon trying to get on one train after another. Finally, they managed to actually get onto a train of flat cars with a whole lot of Japanese troops also with them, traveling up to Hatyai. Hatyai is the station on top. Hatyai was the first actually large Siamese station that they came to. At Hatyai, they were pounced upon by the Siamese immigration authorities, who did not accept the Japanese passes at all. And they locked all 3 of them into the local jail. Fortunately, just before they had got off the train there, they had met a South Indian businessman, a Tamilian businessman, and they got friendly with him a little bit. So from the jail, they managed to persuade the Siamese authorities to allow one of them to go and locate this businessman, and they got him to come back and vouch for them. He didn't do it out of sheer altruism. They had to pay him 450 out of the 600 Straits dollars for the job. But having done that, the Siamese not only allowed them in, they gave them a pass for a 30-day stay in Siam. And they insisted that in 30 days they had to leave Siam. So they caught a train again from Hatyai to Trang. Again at Trang, by now they developed this technique of locating the nearest fairly well-to-do Indian businessman or someone like that whom they could approach for help. As it is, they thought they had a lot of money when they left, but now they were reduced with this 450 Straits dollars going. So at Trang, they met some Chettiar businessmen. The Chettiars were very suave, they knew these were no onion and potato traders. So they promptly suggested that they change their story, that they were looking for family that had disappeared during the Japanese onslaught. And they also told them that there was no point going north towards Bangkok, because there was a lot of anti-Indian sentiment north of Bangkok. So perforce, they had to change their route plan altogether. Chungking was written off, and they had to go to Burma. Accordingly, they decided to reach Ranong, which was the last Siamese place before you entered Burma this side. They took the train to Chumphon, spent the night there in a seedy brothel, sleeping on the corridor. My father seems to say that the bugs bugged him more than the trade that was going on there. And then they took a rickety bus down to Ranong. This was the route to Ranong, and all along, it went along this bay. Both Natarajan and MMP were quite sure they could swim across to Burma and they wouldn't need to go through any immigration authorities and all that. But Radhakrishnan, it turned out, was terrified of water. So all three of them, perforce, had to go to Ranong. In Ranong, they again scouted around and found Abu Bakr, a Mopla businessman who was the most influential person of Indian origin in Ranong at that time. They found that they needed to get a visa from Siam to Burma, though the Japanese were by now in occupation of both places. But to get that visa, they had to go to the Japanese consul, who was a local Japanese photographer who had been appointed the consul for Ranong, his second wife was a Siamese lady. So MMP had to work in her kitchen as a masalchi and plead with her and get her to ask her husband to provide them with visas. Apparently this worked well, and all three were given visas to carry on to Siam. They took the ferry with the last bits of their money. They had very few dollars left, but they managed to reach Point Victoria, which is now called Khao Thong. And here again, they were extremely lucky. The first store that they saw was run by a Mopla called Lamba Kaka, who was apparently the most generous of people that my father had ever met in his life. He looked after them, he saw that they were starving, he gave them meals, and after a couple of days, he made them stay for a couple of days in his store. And then he suggested that they just spend the rest of the war with him, because he could see they were educated, they could help him in his store and things like that. But they obviously decided they had to get back. It was here that they found this man, Lamba Kaka, was literally a benefactor for a lot of the Australian prisoners of war who had been brought here to work as slave labor for the Japanese defenses here. He even managed, by then the monsoon had started, the weather was bad, fishermen were not going out to sea. He even managed to get a fishing boat which agreed to take them up from Ranong to Mergui. Mergui is this place here. Now it's called Mek. So they made a 4-day journey by fishing boat up to Mergui. Bad journey. Radhakrishnan was terrified of the water. The fishermen themselves were a little scared of the Thakin irregulars who were acting as pirates in that area. But they did reach Mergui, and there it turned out that Natarajan had a couple of relatives. So while these two stayed in a seedy hotel, again, cadging their meals and things like that, Natarajan stayed with his relatives. But the very next morning, they found that the entire town knew about their arrival in Mergui, because he had been very indiscreet with his relatives and blabbed to them about what they'd been doing. So they decided post-haste that they had to leave Mergui. There were no buses running at that time. There was no transportation at all because of the Japanese advance that had gone through this area. So they walked from Mergui, they walked all the way to Mulming. This was the worst part of their journey. They hadn't actually walked so far. My father's practicing to get his soles hardened apparently didn't work too well, because by the time they reached Ye, they found they had boils as big as ping pong balls, he says, and which they had to lance along the way. And fortunately, they had this doctor with them, but the doctor's knee started giving him trouble. So And all this route here, which took them quite a few days, from the 28th of May to the 10th of June, they were without money. They were helped by local travelers who were always invariably Indians, who were extremely nice to them and kind to them. And these people fed them. They even got, at one stage, they got a little bus ride on an old Burmese bus, but the bus broke down within a couple of miles. And when they all tried to push the bus, the Burmese got angry with the Indians who were on the bus. They got into a little scrap about things. So it was an entirely nasty walk all the way up to Moulmein. By the time they reached Moulmein, they were quite exhausted and they had not a cent on them. So at Moulmein, they had to cross by ferry, for which they had to pay money. So they sold a watch and a ring from between the three of them to a local Indian businessman, who is the only person MMP claims was not nice to them on the entire trip. But they got 11 rupees for that ring and the watch. Sorry. I've shown you this slide mainly to show you the riverine nature of the Burmese terrain. This is the Salween River, which they're going to cross here by ferry. Of course, the pictures show you all the roads and all that exist today. In those days, there was only a ferry. Later on, they're going to cross near Pegu, they're going to cross the mighty Sitang River. And then thereafter, from Prom, by boat along the Irrawaddy River, and finally on the Chindwin River. And you will see in pictures later how big those rivers are in Burma. Having crossed from Moulmein to Martaban, now called Moketama, they again, they again started walking all the way up. When they reached beyond Kyauktu, they discovered the remnants of the battles that have been fought there, the famous Sitang River battle, with the Japanese had just won against the British and the Indian armies. By the time they reached Hilegu, along this way, they were helped by Indian fish traders. They were helped by people who had come from South India and knew some families that MMP and Natarajan belonged to. So they ran into a lot of people who were extremely helpful to them, but they also saw devastation caused by marauders post the Battle of Sitang River. People were pillaging in that area, so it was quite scary for them until they reached Hilegu. At Hilegu, which is here, at Hilegu, the doctor gave up. His knee had packed up. He was unable to walk anymore. They had managed to get a few cents, which they put him onto a bus to Yangon. They then the two of them walked to Yangon. At Yangon, they again met some fairly well-to-do Indian businessmen, got them to support them for a few days, but they also discovered at Yangon that Natarajan had become very friendly with people whom they thought were INA sympathizers. In fact, they got an offer from a person called Arumugam Pillai to travel in a Japanese submarine to India to be landed as infiltrators. Hearing this, the two, Radhakrishnan and MMP, got very worried, and they told Natarajan they were pushing on. And they caught a train to Prom. Natarajan joined them a few days later. At Prom again, they solicited help from rich Indian businessmen who helped them quite a bit and managed to get a little money from them. And at Prom, Natarajan finally totally gave up the ghost and decided he was going to stay back in Prom and practice as a doctor there. He was going to live out the war in Prom. So Radhakrishnan and MMP carried on from Prom. They bought tickets on a boat that was to take them to a place called Pokoku further up. But at Yenengyong, they were turfed out of the boat and the Japanese army commandeered the boat. So again, they started walking, the two of them. They walked past Saleh, Chowk. They saw a huge ammunition dump near Singhu, past Old Bagan, which was the ancient capital of Burma. And here they got help from a man called John Babu, apparently somebody from the northwest frontier who settled there, who helped them get a boat ride up to Pakoku. On the way at Kinla, in fact, my MMP had to jump into the river to escape Burmese maniacs' drunken attack on him. The tension between the Burmese and the Indians was palpable all the way through. Again, once they got off at Pakoku, traveled on foot all the way up to Moniva. You'll notice here they diverted from the roads because the Japanese army was operating in that area. And they reached Moniva on the 17th of July. At Moniva, they were told by the local shopkeepers, do not go further north. The Japanese army was controlling the whole area north. If they were walking north, they would be in trouble. They had to go by river, on the Chindwin River. The only way to go up the Chindwin River was on a Japanese boat. So the two of them summoned up enough courage. They walked into the Japanese local commander's office and asked for passes to go northwest, to look for a missing brother. Obviously, their story worked with the Japanese commander. After 3 days of pleading, he gave them a pass for the two of them to get onto a boat which would take them from Moniva to Kaleva. That's about 200 miles up the river. Thrilled, they went to the boat, the allotted boat, and there the Japanese officer who was traveling on the boat tore up their passes and told them to get out. They groveled, they pleaded. Finally, luckily for them, the engine driver and the cook went missing. They didn't report. So the Japanese officer asked them, would you be able to run this boat? They were both engineers. And my father had practiced as a masalchi in a house before. So they both said, yes, we'll be the cook and the engine driver. And they embarked on this boat, carrying Japanese soldiers up from Moniva to Kaleva. 200 miles upstream, it took them 4 days. At Kaleva, they promised, the officer had said, I want you for the return journey too. So they promised, yes, we'll come for the return journey. But the return journey was to be 4 to 5 days later. So they said, let's look for this brother of ours and we'll get back. So with no intention to ever get back, they immediately deserted the boat at Kaleva and headed directly west. The next slide will show you the terrain a little clearer. This is Kaleva. They headed west and then tried to catch the road to Tamu. That had been their intended area to reach. But when they reached this village of Indengale, the villagers there told them that it was too dangerous for Indians to go north. You mustn't forget, this is the period, just a month before, 500,000 Indians had either walked or gone by boat or by ship or by air back to India from Burma. A lot of Indians had been actually massacred in these areas, Indian civilians. So they were told, don't think of going up north, Indians will be murdered. So they hung around in Indengale because of a very pleasant headman and his wife. But very soon Japanese patrols, this whole area was the no man's land between the Allies and the Japanese. It became dangerous for them to hang around there because Japanese patrols were landing up there regularly. So they slipped out of Indengale, and this is the area in which they stumbled around, not really knowing where they were going. They crossed the Nayantaya River, the Meeta River. In all these places, my father thinks he deserved the medal for the manner in which he got Radhakrishnan across the river, because Radhakrishnan would refuse to go across the rivers. And he had to scare him and manage to push him across. They passed through a deserted township called Kalemio. And when they reached this fork, they actually decided to go up to Tedim because Tedim seemed to be closer. When they went up there, they met an allied patrol of about 10 or 12 soldiers led by a Havaldar, a Sardarji Havaldar. They'd reached allied lines. But the Sardarji Havaldar was not willing to buy their story that they'd come from Singapore. And he said, you go back the way you've come. I'm not allowing you inside. When my father started pleading with him, he opened fire with his carbine. And my father had to jump to dodge the bullets. And he says initially he was scared, but then he got angry. And he yelled at this Havaldar in chaste Punjabi. All the galis that he could think of, he yelled at him. It worked because the Havaldar got a little bothered. Only an officer might have the temerity to speak to him like that. So he allowed them to go with him just another 800 yards or so to a place called Fort White, stockade number 3, where there was an officer who accepted this story but sent them down under escort to the battalion headquarters at Phalam. This is the town of Phalam, and that's the area of Fort White. At Phalam, they were both, MMP had started the journey probably at about 154 pounds. He was by now 90 pounds in weight. So they were both hospitalized immediately, and it took them quite a while to recover. But while they were in the hospital bed, the doctor actually came up to my father and told him the date. He didn't know the date. This is the 8th of August. Remember the date? Because this is the Quit India movement had started on that date. And all the Congress officials were being rounded up, including in the town of Phalam. So from Phalam, they were sent after a few days. They reached Aizawl on the 18th of August. From Aizawl to Silchar, all this by motor transport. From Silchar down to Calcutta by train. And from train to Delhi. Because by now, cables were flying. Send these guys, we need to interrogate them, etc. This is an overview of the full journey. From Singapore, by train, by boat, walking, up to Kalewa. And this was Moniwa, sorry, this is Kalewa, and this is Phalam. From there, they were accompanied all the way back into India. As my father used to say, 1,000 miles by train, 1,000 miles by boat, and 1,000 miles on foot. That's the story of their escape.
One could picture the whole journey. You mentioned that, your father lost from 154 pounds to 90 pounds, which for those who are now thinking kilos was 70 kilos to 41 kilos. So you can imagine the drop. Most of the days, as they had either no meal at all, or only peanuts and one tea, and every second or third day they had one meal of rice. How do you think he was able to withstand it? Because the other guy, Radhakrishnan, as you said, actually passed away a couple of years later. The journey was so difficult that he couldn't survive. What was, your father's physical condition? Was he really a tough guy, or was it more mental?
Actually, my MMP was a fairly slightly built person. He lost all this weight, and it took him 6 months later in Pune to recover. When he was sent to the center in Kirki, he kept going into hospital every now and then. He also had a minder, someone who watched him just in case he was actually an infiltrator. But once those 6 months was over, he was fit enough. He eventually ended up as an instructor in the jungle warfare school that had been set up here near Shimoga. Radhakrishnan, on the other hand, wasted away. He literally died within 3 years. He never recovered from the trip. Though he was a tall, strapping 6-foot man, he never recovered from the privations of the journey. And he died in Guntur 3 years later, in 1945 itself. Dr. Natarajan, who never left Burma thereafter in Prom, he apparently did practice as a doctor in Prom, but he also died early in 1951. Actually, my father remained eternally grateful to all the, no one travels by road, walking on the road, if you're well-to-do. You go by car or you go by your bullock cart. The people walking on the roads in Malaya, Burma, and Siam were all people who were destitute. So it was these people who helped him. They shared their meals with them. As Viju pointed out, there were days in which they ate just peanuts and water. And they hadn't really planned their meals or anything in any logical way. So it ended up by them being quite ad hoc. Occasionally they'd have a great meal with the rich people that they met at Prom or at Rangoon for 3-4 days, and then they'd again be starving.
Have diarrhea.
Yes, and lots of diarrhea on the way.
The other interesting thing is, as you pointed out, there was only one instance where somebody actually asked for money. A large number of people helped them with whatever they had, and most of them were poor. Many of the shopkeepers were also Muslim, as it happened. Right? Many of them, Abu Bakr, John Babu, Lambu Kaka, and so on and so on. And again, no one seemed to, care. Plus, of course, all the Chettiars. One of the interesting things is that it's mentioned that the Chettiars were not the owners. The owners are sitting in India. They were only the local reps. But they seem to have full independence in running an authority to run their businesses, use their money in whatever way they wanted, etc. Do you, want to say something more about that?
I learned a little bit about this speaking to MMP when we were kids. Not too much, but the Chettiar businessmen there were, yes, as you pointed out, the second in command really, literally the person running the business for the owner. They all had families in India and families in Burma. They were resented for the fact that they ran a second family in Burma. The Burmese men didn't like it. And they were obviously, this is what happens to Indians in many parts of the world. They end up being so hardworking, successful, etc. So they were resented. Right through this journey, you could make out they were helped mainly by poor and rich Indians along the way. And a lot of, as you pointed out, people, Muslim traders. But then the large number of Muslim traders and Chettiars, that's the kind of Indian population you have in those areas. And I always remember that he would always talk in very glowing terms of even the poorest person there was. Because he was eternally grateful for the help that they'd given him.
The other very interesting thing is that in this journey, most of their interactions with the Japanese were either friendly or funny. It was almost like they were not scared of the Japanese, they were scared of the Burmese more.
Very true.
It's the extent of resentment between the Burmese and the Indians seemed quite incredibly,
Apparently, I have not traveled in Burma myself, but apparently there was quite a bit of it. Was much like the Sinhalas and the Tamils in the north of Sri Lanka. The Indian business community was resented in Burma quite a bit. On the other hand, I would point out to you that while they seem to have managed to work with the Japanese officials on the way, but the behavior of the Japanese in the prisoner of war camps was pretty brutal. He's not mentioned it in his book, but occasionally when he talked to us, he would talk of beheadings in the camp. In fact, those days they called them Jamadar. Now you call him a Naib Subadar. The Jamadar of his company was beheaded in the camp. And it frightened MMP quite a bit, I remember. I remember him talking about that. Beheaded for no reason whatsoever. And also, you mustn't forget, this was the period in which the Japanese were wooing Indians and Malays. They wanted the Indians to join the INA at that time, right through. And though I don't think that had anything to do with the interactions that he had with the Japanese officials at Penang or at Muniwa, I think from when I read in his book, they were so desperate, they were pleading with the Japanese at that time, and the Japanese liked to lord it over them at that time,
The example, you can talk about the guy who takes all his money and his watch and so on. The first interaction with the Japanese.
The first interaction he had with any Japanese person was on the day of the surrender, when he was trying to round up the Indian soldiers of his company. Because he'd been ordered by Dinwoody to take all the Indian soldiers to Farrer Park. While he was rounding them up, he came across a Japanese soldier walking down, and the Japanese soldier immediately demanded all his watch and his money and all that. So he gave it all to him because they had surrendered, they had no weapons. In the process, he found a ring on my father's finger. So he took out his knife to cut off the finger to remove the ring because it wasn't coming off. And just then, luckily for him, a Japanese officer walked past and my MMP yelled out to him, "Look at what he's doing." So the Japanese officer beat up that soldier, collected all the loot that he'd collected from various other people and made my father take it all. He gave him 3-4 watches, 10 rings and stuff like that and said, "Take this off." So that's the only incident that he gained out of the Japanese interaction.
Once he, got back and he was debriefed in great detail, and then they recommended the military cross for both of them. So Radhakrishnan was probably the only civilian ever to get a military cross.
Absolutely.
So tell us about how they managed it, and that it was a fake army.
When they were debriefed first at Phalam was the battalion headquarters. So my father introduced Radhakrishnan as Lieutenant Radhakrishnan of the Singapore Volunteers. Now, such an organization did not exist, but as I'll tell you a little later, but who the British authorities here didn't know. There had been no contact from Singapore whatsoever. So Lieutenant Radhakrishnan as the Singapore Volunteers. In fact, you can read the London Gazette, which says MC Military Cross awarded to Lieutenant M.M. Pillai, Bombay Sappers, and Lieutenant K. Radhakrishnan of the Singapore Volunteers. When all this charade carried on until they reached Delhi. During the interrogation in Delhi, my father kind of broke down and admitted that yes, Radhakrishnan was not a military man, but that he had carried on this deception just so that they didn't think he was an INA infiltrator. So the solution was very elegant. They just said, okay, we've given him the military cross already, because they were given the military cross literally within the day of their arrival at Delhi. So since we've already awarded the military cross, we can't have it given to a civilian. They made him a lieutenant in the Bombay Sappers immediately. Though he never actually served in the Bombay Sappers. He was gazetted as a lieutenant in Bombay Sappers and given the military cross. The only known case, as far as I know, of a civilian ever being awarded the military cross. There were the 3 more officers who escaped later. Actually, they escaped. They escaped 2 days before MMP and Radhakrishnan. They left a camp called Tenga. 2 Sardaji officers and a Maratha officer. They left on the 4th of June. 4th of May, sorry, yes. But unfortunately, they reached finally in October, which is why they weren't subjected to the debriefing and all that MMP was subjected to. But they also were all awarded the military cross. And there was also an Australian officer who belonged to the RAF, who escaped from Pasir Panjang prison, the POW camp, and he managed to get a boat. He managed to get a boat to Sumatra, and from Sumatra he managed to hop on island to island, and he reached Darwin finally in December. He actually left in April but reached in December. Along the way, he had another Australian officer who was a companion with him who died on the way. And of course, but the most infamous escapee was Major General Gordon Bennett, the divisional commander of the Australian division, the Australian 8th Division. He deserted his division on the 15th of February in 1942 and managed to get away when they were evacuating families. He got away to Australia on the 15th of February itself. It caused quite a furore in Australia and amongst the Allies, though he subsequently apparently very nearly became the chief of the Australian Defence Forces.
The commander-in-chief of the forces in India, Wavell, met MMP more than once. So tell us about those interactions. While
he was being interrogated in Delhi, since they were the first to come from Singapore, and I'm not sure that they had the kind of wireless connection with any agents in Singapore. Those of you who read some history of that period will remember something called Force 136, which was left behind planters who actually stayed back in Malaya and formed a clandestine group. And they were the ones who were in radio contact with Delhi. But at that time, when MMP and Radhakrishnan came back, there was no radio contact whatsoever with Delhi. So they were actually the only news they had from Singapore. In fact, if you read the intelligence report, it is one of the most exhaustive intelligence reports I've ever read in a debrief. The kind of questioning that went on. During those debriefs in South Block, Wavell would walk in and sit at the back and keep listening. And apparently he did this several times. They were so keen to get information from Singapore at that time. So on the last occasion, he did meet my father, and of course, my father made quite a blunder. I think he said, "I'm from the non-martial classes." So Wavell just laughed and said, you've done enough to become a martial man yourself.
You said that if I were you, I'd be telling my grandchildren over the fire and all that stuff. He also asked him, where are you from, right? And your father said, oh, deep south, you won't know. He said, what do you mean I don't know? Tell me and all that.
Apparently, Wavell had nearly died in a swimming accident somewhere near my father's hometown. So he knew Tinnevelly quite well.
So shall we open it up for questions? Please, anyone wants to say anything?
Question is, did he run into any INA people on his walking and riding adventures? Because at that time you couldn't tell who was loyal to the British Empire and who was against the British Empire. There's a lot of mutual suspicion and all that between Indians in Burma and that part of the world. Does he mention anything in his book?
No, actually he had no interaction with the INA people during his escape. But I did forget to mention, as Viju was just pointing out, they got passes from the India International League, which was the forerunner of the INA. Radhakrishnan knew someone in the India International League in Singapore, and he approached him and got passes under false names. So that was the only interaction with the INA for this escape. But yes, the INA was very active. In fact, if you read the list of names, many officers joined the INA out of patriotism, out of a feeling of following Subhash Chandra Bose. But the initial part, I don't know if you're aware that the INA actually was in two parts. The first INA lasted from February 1942 to October 1942. And then the INA was almost disbanded. Mohan Singh, who was the general of the INA at that time, was actually arrested by the Japanese. And he was sent to, I think, Borneo for some time. And the INA was resurrected when Raj Bihari Bose came down from Japan and Subhash Chandra Bose came down from Germany, and they resurrected it. But in the camps, yes, when I mentioned that he was looking for colleagues and compatriots, he had to be extremely careful about whom he spoke to. For example, he did mention to me once, a long time ago, that he spoke to a Colonel Bhosle, who was one of the senior most officers at that time. But as it turned out, Colonel Bhosle was an enthusiastic supporter of the INA later. And Colonel Bhosle initially seemed to be stringing my father along until my father backed off at a certain stage and realized I shouldn't be talking to him too much. So there were those kind of interactions. But it wasn't, on the way, there were no interactions with the INA.
Because I think ultimately the INA was defeated by the British Indian Army in the jungles of Burma.
Now, we're getting into very controversial areas here, in one sense, because the INA is now being built up as the alternative to the Gandhi-Nehru sort of civil disobedience campaign. But actually, yes, you're right. The INA was very soundly defeated by the same Indian troops who had been driven away by the Japanese. But then there are a lot of mitigating factors. That was much later, in 44, 45. The mitigating factor was the Japanese did not support the INA militarily. They actually left them initially they didn't even give them any jobs. They made them act as rear echelon soldiers. And it's only later they allowed them in front, and there I think the INA were very badly served as far as logistics is concerned.
Yeah, they got very few supplies and stuff from the
That's
Japanese.
right. Yeah.
I have traveled in Japan and looked at the history of Japan, Burma. And what I found was that Burma was actually a part of the British India. It was till independence almost.
1936.
Correct. And it was the work ethic of the Indians. The British actually moved Indians there. And so almost all the elite jobs, the doctors, the school teachers, everybody was Indian. So there was a lot of resentment against the Indians.
You're right. So in fact, in the book that my father wrote but never published, which my brother published many, many years later, my father never published that book because he didn't want to. He thought his facts were not absolutely right. He might have misremembered some things. And he insisted, he tried his best to get a hold of the intelligence debrief that the British had on file. Normally, documents of this kind are kept for 30 years. But for some reason, and which we found out later, these belong to the documents that were kept for 50 years. Mainly because there were names in the debrief, all the names of people who had helped them and stuff like that. So when we finally got the debriefing documents, my brother located them in London, and he made a comparison between the book and made a few corrections. We found that my father had written about 4 or 5 pages entirely on the relationship between the Burmese male and the Indian male, on how the Indian man had supplanted the Burmese man in the family life of Burma, and how that's why they resented us so badly out there.
Actually, George Orwell, the famous writer, has written a wonderful book called Burmese Days.
Yes.
And one of the main characters in that is a South Indian doctor. I want to, it's an extraordinary story. Your father's incredible adventure, and I would say it would make a stunning film. If there were serious filmmakers, it would make a stunningly interesting film. Thank you.
My question is, Britishers never helped any Indians to escape, is it? Like they escaped themselves from Singapore and they left Indians back there. Is it correct?
Not really, sir. No. There were no other escapes other than those 3 officers who escaped from Tenga, 2 Australians who escaped from Pasir Panjang, and Radhakrishnan and my father who escaped from Bidadari and Tayasol. There were no other escapes from Singapore ever. Just to put it into context.
There are few in the internet which shows that between 12th of February to 15th of February, there were many ships that escaped, took away only the Britishers.
Actually, you're right, sir. You're absolutely correct. On the 12th of February, the General Percival knew that he was defeated. He knew that he would have to hand over. But as it happens, the main battle on Bukit Timah was fought on the 14th. But evacuations had started from the eastern side of Singapore, where the harbour was, They'd started some evacuations by boat, by ships. Many of those ships were strafed by Japanese aircraft. Many people died. Many families escaped, but only one actual officer escaped in that. That's Major General Gordon Bennett. The other officers who escaped all escaped before the surrender. There were no other escapes from a prisoner of war as a prisoner of war. They escaped much before the surrender. Evacuation. There were evacuations.
And also, after surrendering to Japanese, and since Bose was in good terms with them, did he not help Indians to have a better living rather than this one? Like, why did there was a tragic incident? I think Indians fought against Indians on one side with Japanese, on the other side with Britishers.
Actually,
Could
sir,
that not have been avoided?
Bose was not in Japan or Singapore at that time. He was in Berlin. Bose was in Germany at that time. In fact, the first 8 or 9 months of the INA was all led by this young captain called Mohan Singh, who had been up to general, along with a Sardarji priest called Pritam Singh. They were the two leaders of the INA for the first 8 or 10 months. After that broke down, when the Japanese lost faith in Mohan Singh, Raj Behari Bose came from Japan, resurrected the INA. In fact, most of the people who joined the INA joined in 1943, not even in 1942. In 1943, a lot of...
How many Indian POWs were there in Singapore?
67,340.
All of them were held by Japanese and handed over to INA?
No, they were offered, like I said, the Japanese officers of the Kempeitai, the intelligence branch, and the INA officers would make speeches to them, would offer blandishments to them to join and they appealed to their patriotism, they appealed to all sorts of things. I believe, I'm not sure about my facts here, I believe about 15,000 Indian prisoners did join the INA. The vast number of the INA adherents are actually young men from Singapore and Malaya who didn't join the INA. It was not soldiers and officers of the Indian Army. Vast numbers joined separately. So these soldiers who did join, many were motivated by patriotism, many were motivated by just being fed up of being in a prisoner of war camp. Some were coerced, there's no doubt about it, some were coerced. The INA has a very strange history, but the INA never actually participated in any battle against an Indian formation. I don't think it's recorded anywhere.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I visited Bukit Timah very recently, in February, which was again on the date of that 80th.
But it's so built up, you can't believe a battle was fought there.
No, there is a memorial which stands, and it tells mostly about all these things. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating, and I would definitely like to read the book that your father wrote. By a coincidence, my parents and I watched a movie last night on Amazon Prime, Unbroken. It's about a US high school boy who was a track and field member of the Olympic team of the US, Luis Zamperini, who then participated in the Berlin Olympics and then joined the US Air Force and fought in the Marshall Islands, and he was captured by the Japanese. So when you talked about beheading and the violence, I can directly relate to it because it's just fresh from last evening. So this Zamperini person, at the end of he wanted to take part in the Tokyo Olympics, which was called off because of the war. But eventually he did. At age 80, he ran with the Olympic torch in Tokyo.
Oh.
And he went back, met his captors, made peace with them, except the prison commander who refused to meet him. Because this guy, the commander could not break his spirit at all. But it's a beautiful story of how it was such a traumatic time of his life, but he went back to meet those people and to make peace with those people there. So coming to MMP, did he go back to Singapore and to all those places? Did he revisit, meet the people who had helped him, and was he in touch with them after the war?
You know, we used to ask MMP quite often, how are you working with, because when he retired from the army, He was actually working in Calcutta building trucks and tractors for the army. And he was interacting with Komatsu. And he used to interact with lots of Japanese. In fact, he used to play golf with the Japanese officials. And we had dinners with them at their house and they came to our house. Once I remember my brother and I asked him, how did you manage to... He said, look, individually, I had nothing against them. It's just that they were part of a system. And maybe he was just a forgiving man or whatever he was, but I don't think he held any rancor against the Japanese themselves. But the physical fact, in fact, we've been talking about this. What led the Japanese to behave in the manner they did? I suspect, and this is just thinking on the top of my head, it's because of the experience in China where they ran rampage and the cruelty that they showed to the Chinese continued right through the war thereafter. And they were fighting in China from 1931.
I'm sure, many of us know Germans. You can't take it out against every German today because there was a Nazi party at one time. There's an interesting article in the Mint today or yesterday or something. Something similar that, the whole principle of justice is that you can't take out on today on somebody because his ancestors did something.
True. Did he physically visit the places again?
No, that is his biggest regret. In fact, he never went back to Singapore in fact, I don't think he traveled abroad except once to London after that. I don't think he ever traveled abroad. There was another generation, Our generation is traveling abroad and all that.
I think he had enough international travel for one lifetime.
Good evening. My name is Ranganathan. I have two questions. One is about surviving this arduous trip. From the name Pillai, I presume he was a vegetarian.
They were both vegetarians, yes.
Yeah. So, with that, if he had lasted, it's a great tribute. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. My second question is, you mentioned about the Australian who escaped, but there was some stigma of desertion. So, when does this stigma attach? Because the others also escaped. They also left the soldiers. So, what is the red litmus test for desertion?
Good point, sir. About vegetarians, yes, he was a vegetarian. He remained a vegetarian all his life. But I don't... It did affect him in one sense. He was much more than his sons worried about it. He always worried about the fact that he was considered a non-martial. Those days the military had this martial race idea, which was a legacy of the British. It was a totally misconceived idea in my opinion, but it still remained imbued in people. But I think he never really got over it, and he never changed to being a non-vegetarian, I assure you. Regarding the stigma, firstly, General Bennett, I mentioned General Bennett. The other Australian who escaped, he escaped after being a prisoner of war. Right? But Major General Gordon Bennett, who fancied himself a bit of a Patton or a MacArthur, in fact, he was always fighting with his superiors also in Malaya. He actually left on the 15th night. While Percival was there signing the surrender document, he got a boat and got out of Singapore. He did not even inform his second in command. It caused a huge fuss in Australia when people found out that he had left them all behind. Initially, he portrayed himself as having escaped to fight another day. But when people found out that he'd actually, in a sense, deserted his division, it did cause quite a ruckus out there. But as you pointed out, the stigma did not really attach because he was considered for the chief of the army in the Australian army subsequently.
Yeah. Thank you.
Would it be fair to say that when you're a prisoner, it's your duty to escape? So this is a question of whether you become a prisoner or not.
I confess, being a naval man myself, I don't know about this in the sense that we are never taught duties of a prisoner of war. But I believe in the army, maybe in the Air Force also for all you know, that if you're a prisoner of war, your first duty is to escape. What the gentleman pointed out is that he still left his soldiers behind. You know, he couldn't have organized an escape for all of them. There's no way. But just as a matter of interest, you might, when people escaped in prisoner of war camps from Germany and Italy, sometimes there were mass escapes. As many as 100 people escaped together. Not all of them were successful, but about 10% of all escapes were successful eventually.
The other officer, Preetham Singh was his name, who escaped from Tanga. He wrote about a lot of local antagonism against the Indians as they were escaping through Burma. And in fact, they were betrayed 3 or 4 times and handed over to Japanese troops, only to be able to escape from them again and again. So did anything like that happen to your father?
No, apparently not.
Ever betrayed by the local people?
No, not apparently not. When you go through Preetham Singh's book, by the way, Preetham Singh's son and my brother went to school together eventually. You know, they were all one community together. Preetham Singh's, they were singularly unfortunate in the fact that they ran into some places where they were let down by the local people. That was not the experience that my father went through. I think because they were probably, both of them were Sardars and one Maratha officer. They probably weren't as easily able to get to know the South Indian people who were the businessmen. The richer people, they were the South Indians at that time, you know. So to them, it was easier to get access. Here, probably they didn't. I don't know the details of that.
But they weren't helped along at all. I mean,
they were helped continuously. My father, and that's what he keeps saying.
So it's
he was
completely different from that experience.
He was helped all along. Always been remaining.
He was helped by the South Indians they went and met, not by the Burmese, except in one case.
Not by the Burmese.
Except that one headman thing.
Thank you.